Hello and welcome to the Tifo Football Podcast. I'm Joe Devine and today I was delighted to be joined by Murad Ahmed, sports correspondent for the Financial Times. I spoke to Murad about a few different things. Firstly, the economic impact of the coronavirus on football, why clubs have to finish their leagues to avoid what could be disastrous economic consequences, how the length of the lockdown is the major factor, and all of the potential ramifications of there being no football, of which there are many. Secondly, we spoke about a story that Murad covered recently on Jim Rattcliffe, British billionaire, who through his company Ineos, I can't remember, Murad told me how to pronounce it properly in the podcast, but I've already forgotten. Ineos, I think it is. Through his company Ineos, Jim Rattcliffe has now spent £400 million investing and sponsoring different sports. Critics of Rattcliffe say that he is using sports to greenwash the environmental damage that his chemical company does. Chemical company. But supporters say that he's just sports mad. Where's the line? What is sportswashing or greenwashing in this case? And why would someone spend £400 million on sport if it made them no money? Also, we discussed the City Football Group and the Red Bull Network, why clubs would want to form networks like this. And finally, I asked Murad a little bit about himself. Starting out as a tech reporter, how did he find himself chatting to chief executives of PL clubs, governing bodies and footballers, working at the Financial Times, which is just an all-round cool place. Before I get started, I should say that this episode is supported by The Athletic, one of the best places to read about football online and personally totally crucial to my sanity this week as I self-isolate. You can get a 7-day free trial, see if you like it. And if you do, you can get 50% off an annual subscription. That is £2.50 per month. Super affordable. Please go and do that. That is theathletic.co.uk/Tifo. You can get your 7-day free trial there, get started, and hopefully enjoy a 50% off annual subscription. Anyway, I was really pleased that Murad joined me today due to the current situation. However, we were, of course, prohibited from meeting in person to record the episode. So Murad chatted to me over the internet from his own house. Imagine that. He's a fascinating guy, real deep knowledge of football business. So it was a real pleasure to have him talk me through the following. Okay, so Murad, can I first ask you about coronavirus? Hey, what a surprise! It's what we're interested in, I think, particularly is the economic impact on football, and obviously we're all anticipating that top level clubs will probably be okay. But can I ask you, at what sort of league level, if it's possible to answer this question, are we potentially going to see long term or even like catastrophic dangers for clubs, and why would that be?
Yeah, a lot of clubs are trying to work through this at the moment. So here's the current state of play. We've got suspended leagues across Europe, and the crucial decision that had to be made was what happened to the Euro 2020 championships, because it was creating this kind of bookend to the season. And a lot of the domestic leagues can't resume if they've got this huge mega tournament in the middle. So they pushed that to 2021, and the idea is to buy time for all the leagues to finish, the Champions League to finish, the Europa League to finish in some way. It's just push that off and see if the summer can be filled with domestic football from across Europe. And if the coronavirus peak is in May, June, and we have governments starting to open up after that, and maybe you can start playing games behind closed doors, for example, in that period, then there's a kind of plausible scenario where you could finish the season pretty much as is, and that would have relatively limited impacts,
right,
on across football. But here's a big but. The reason why you have to try and finish the season as it is broadcasting contracts are paid according to how much content you have, how many games are shown. So say the Premier League, that's hundreds of millions of pounds that they would put on the table if you didn't finish the season. So West Ham United's Karen Brady saying you should have a null and void season. The reason why that's completely logical at this point to do is that you're going to leave a lot of money on the table. That's
right. Yeah.
And then the three main sources of income for a club: broadcasting, ticketing and matchday income, and then sponsorship. And sponsorship would also go down under the same rules as broadcasting. You've got to have something to sponsor against. And then there's if you're even playing games behind closed doors, there's a big hit. Now, when this whole thing happened, there was a feeling that insurance policies would just pick this up, that the huge hit on income would be caught by insurance, and that's what insurance is for. But you got to think about how these insurance contracts have been done. Most of these insurance contracts for most clubs, I don't know, speaking to them all week, they cover maybe one or two games that are lost. They're usually covering things like you're having to call off a game because there's a freak weather condition last minute and you've paid all the staff to be there and you're having to refund tickets even though you're going to rearrange the game.
Right,
and
yeah.
That's what the insurance policy covers. Nobody, it seems to me, even at the level of the Premier League, has something comprehensive that can deal with a cancelled season. Everyone's going to take a massive hit if that happens. So that's a kind of starting point. Now, when you start going lower down the leagues, say in the Championship and below, this is a really critical time, because if you don't play the games, they are much more reliant on ticketing income than broadcasting income. Most of the teams in the Championships are already making a loss. And I spoke to Leeds United's chief executive, Angus Kinnear, earlier this week, and he said that banks are already starting to stop lending to football clubs, partly because we, the media, are so obsessed with football. Everybody knows what the situation is with football at the moment, knows that it's all shut down, and the banks don't need a team of analysts to work out that this is going to be a huge hit on business.
Right, yeah.
So there's this ripple effect happens if banks aren't lending to you when you don't have any income coming in. There's a cash crunch. You can't pay staff. You can't pay your suppliers. You eventually won't be able to pay your players. You're going to go bust. And if this continues on for a few more months into September and so on, you are going to see teams down the leagues go out of business. It's impossible to see a scenario that doesn't happen in.
Right.
So there's all sorts of weird things that are happening right now. Just one more thing, like things like player contracts tend to run out in June at the end of the season. So you're going to have a whole load of players as free agents, but with no football coming up. So they either could be let loose or they could start being poached by lots of other teams effectively in the middle of a season.
Yeah.
So you need all the leagues to work out how to do that, how to deal with that. And transfer fees are not paid up front. So the 60 million paid for Bruno Fernandes by Manchester United, that's paid over the lifetime of his 5 or 6 year contract.
Yeah.
And so the tranches start having to be paid. So you're going to have this scenario where lots of clubs are having to suddenly pay each other their next tranche of transfer fees, but they can't afford to because there's no money coming in, and they're all going to be in debt to each other. So you're going to have this huge debt boom across football clubs where they all owe each other money, and they can't survive without the money that is due to each other, and it's a systemic shock to the entire football industry.
Right.
So I think without football being played for a long period of time, these clubs, even at the top end, will go out of business. So they've got to find a way of getting the games back on.
Right. And can I ask you about the process in which they do go out of business? I mean, the recent examples of Bury, for example, and we've had other clubs in the last 10 years or so. What is the order of events here? Because we hear words like administration, liquidation, going bust, these sorts of things. In what order does this take place, and what can supporters expect if the delays were to extend beyond the summer?
Well, this is so unprecedented that it's a case like Bury or a club that's teetering like Oldham Athletic even before all of this started happening.
Yeah.
It's very hard to see them as analogous cases. So a Bury goes into administration. Administration effectively means somebody from the outside comes in and looks through the books and says, okay, you've got a whole list of creditors, money that's owed to various different suppliers or whoever owns the debt. In Bury's case, it was people who owned the stadium and parking spaces and all sorts of stuff that was going on there. And they pick an order of who should get paid, and then they start divvying up what money is left between the people who are owed. That's a kind of administration. That's an orderly administration. What we're talking about here is a load of football clubs all not having any money for the obvious reason that there is no football. They would immediately there's no need to have an administrator. They've got no assets, probably. You would think, and they would just fall over. They'd be liquidated. But if this was happening, we're going to be seeing this across the country in restaurants and pubs and all sorts of different ways, and football clubs will be the last of it. So all I'm saying is there's a very good reason why this talk of null and voiding the season is a kind of madness. They've got to find a way of putting games on one way or the other.
Even if it's behind closed doors.
Even if it's behind closed doors, you've just got to get the games on, because at least you defend the broadcasting contracts in the professional leagues, and we're not even talking about non-league teams and all and everyone else who just don't benefit from that. So that is the kind of ripple effect that we're about to see across football.
Yeah.
It's done to a certain calendar, but I think everyone's going to have to start being creative very, very quickly and work out a completely different calendar just to get things over the line and get things done.
Wow. Okay. I mean, I did have a question written down here, which seems kind of stupid to ask you now, which is, do you think that this could be a transformational period for football? I assume you do think that, Murad.
I thought, well, yeah.
It could be, right?
So look, it could be that we're all overdoing it, and that the peak comes and goes, and the UK and everyone else has taken relatively strong measures, and there's an impact to life that we'll always remember for the rest of our lives, but we kind of move on. But if anyone has read the kind of the Imperial College model of what this disease is going to do over the next 18 months, the likelihood is, at the moment, the way they've modeled it, is that we're going to have these measures in place of, no public gatherings, a lockdown across much of the country, very little economic activity, and then for a few months that'll suppress the disease in a way that will hopefully allow us to allow the NHS not to be completely overwhelmed. But it's only suppressed, and the moment we start doing mass gatherings again, going back to school, going back to university, going to work, the disease will pop up again and the government will tell us to shut down all over, and this will happen periodically until we have a vaccine. If that is what's going to happen next, football is going to be on and off for 18 months until we have a vaccine for this thing. And if that happens, you will see a lot of clubs go bust, because you just won't be able to play the games at all.
Right, and I guess that's why you're saying they'd have to be creative with their scheduling, right? Can I ask you a specific question about? So let's say, for example, that the worst case scenario doesn't occur, that the lockdowns across Europe and across the UK, and I guess the rest of the world as well, help to suppress the disease enough that it isn't spreading to vulnerable people, or at least if vulnerable people are in lockdown for longer, the healthcares can manage it over a period of time, and maybe mass gatherings are okay again, right?
Yeah.
Are there any? Is it possible, a hypothetical situation, that there'll be particular owners of football clubs who will have taken a huge hit over this period from their other businesses, which might impact on football itself? And the same question, I suppose, for sponsors as well. Are there any big companies who sponsor football who might struggle as a result of the economic decline at the moment, and potentially renege on deals, or we could see issues coming into football that way?
Yeah, I've been trying to think about who's the most vulnerable here, and I at the moment I just don't have a great answer for you.
What type of businesses are the most vulnerable, just generally?
It's anything that involves travel.
Yeah.
So airlines, they're going to need a bailout of some sort. Hospitality and leisure, restaurants, hotels. Those are the kind of the immediate vulnerable industries. But it kind of all the media industry is also vulnerable in weird ways. So let's talk about something like Sky Sports.
Yeah.
Sky Sports have nothing to show at the moment.
Yeah.
Basically, they're already talking about giving up, subscriptions and saying, look, you can have your subscription on hold for the foreseeable future. If we're talking about months without actual sport, that's a whole load of money that goes out of Sky's pocket, and it's hard to see how they don't decide to switch to a model that isn't so fixated on live sport. Live sport is so been the lifeblood of a subscription TV business like Sky for a long time.
Yeah.
So it is really, really unpredictable. Who else in the wider football industry is going to get affected by this? And I've I'm trying to think of if there's a particular owner that is big in a particular industry that could be affected. But no one
comes to mind for me.
Yeah, no one comes to mind, and a lot of the big sporting owners are in say the Premier League. They're in the football business a lot of the time, or they're in the sport business. The Glazers at Manchester United, their money's primarily kind of stuck in sport, or FSG at Liverpool. Again, that's a kind of a sporting entity. They're all relatively kind of quite strong. My greater worry actually is that even a short-term disruption is going to really hit small community clubs up and down the country.
Yeah, which would be devastating, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. I mean, it's interesting actually. When we were emailing about this before, and I was reading and thinking about it, it strikes me that football at the moment is, as it normally is, to be honest, a pretty good microcosm for viewing the rest of society. I mean, I don't know about you and your personal life, but I know at least a couple of people who have been sent home from work, who work in like the entertainment industry, or like in the theatre, or in pubs and venues and stuff, who now are either on unpaid leave or don't have a job, right? Which is like the kind of horrific consequence of what's happening at the moment. And you can see when you watch the news and you read the newspapers that really what the virus is doing more than anything else is just illuminating the problems of financial imbalance that we already have. And in football, you can see that clearly, right? I mean, it's interesting to hear from you that you think top level clubs could be affected if this goes on for long enough, but like undoubtedly it's the smaller leagues and the smaller clubs which are going to fold first. And this is a persistent problem, virus aside. You only really needed something like this, which is pretty unprecedented, but to really just kind of shine a light on the cracks that were already there. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, that's really fair. And so a good way to think about it is what football clubs are. They're called clubs, they're not called companies.
Yeah,
they're representative of areas up and down the country. So the example of Leeds United, right? So we all see Leeds United and we think of the players and we think of the team and its glory days, whatever. But what is Leeds United now? Leeds United employs about 250 members of staff. They've got nothing to do, and it seems right now they're being paid. But that ramps up to about a couple of thousand people on a match day, plus 400 odd suppliers of food and everything else that needs to be done to have 35,000 people in Ellen Road, and that is not happening right now.
Yeah,
this is that temporary staff, all of that money is not being spent. It's a kind of a ripple effect over a small community, and that has been repeated over and over again across the country. And this is just the football industry, right? The reason why we're talking about it so much is that football sport has an outsized influence on the rest of society. Like we think of Manchester United as this mega thing, this huge beast of an entity that's spoken about all around the world, which it is. But in money terms, it's a relatively small business in world terms.
Yeah.
Like my job is at the Financial Times, and I get a lot of ribbing that I'm spending a lot of time covering pretty small companies compared to the ones that my colleagues are covering any day of the week. The reason why you've got me dedicated to doing it, and there's an endless supply of stories which I'm giving even now, is because culturally the cachet of sport and football is much higher, so there's a lot more focus on it. But like you say, that ripple effect is being felt right now. And will continue to be felt. Look, I've painted this a kind of apocalyptic scenario, but I'm reasonably hopeful but that actually there will be a solution that will work, and that we can get back to playing games again and talking about the actual sport. Partly because, and I've spent all week talking to club execs, and they're kind of in a particular mode right now, which is the first chance they can to play the games, even behind closed doors, they will take it.
Right.
And they will be quite inventive about doing it. There's stuff going on about how you play the Champions League, at the moment. So there's a kind of conversation where maybe you could do one leg ties, and then a Final Four tournament over the course of a weekend or a few days. You'd have to rip up rule books and you'd have to vote for complete change.
Sure.
But that would be already in my head. That's pretty exciting.
That is pretty cool. I was just thinking that when you were saying it.
The Champions League across neutral venues, plus a Final Four tournament. I'd want to watch that.
Plus, if you're stuck in your house, what better thing to do over the weekend?
Right. The issue always was, a lot of this, the fanciful planning before the shutdown, was they hadn't really fully thought through the scenario of when players start getting this. And they are human beings like the rest of us. And the moment Mikel Arteta contracted coronavirus, it was just no chance of football coming back. And that is a wider worry. A lot of players are going to start contracting this over the next few weeks and months. And in that scenario, how are you going to complete games?
Yeah.
That it's just impossible to see. So give it a few weeks, we'll know where we are. It could be that football's the last thing on our mind anyway. My guess is at the moment it looks like we're gonna find some way of completing the season, and the more critical effects will be allayed, other than maybe for the smaller clubs.
When you were talking about Manchester United, it struck me that Ed Woodward's idea that what happens on the football pitch is not that important for the business is going to be tested quite heavily at the moment.
Yeah,
it's looking pretty stupid right now.
Yeah, I was talking. So, and also there are weird opportunities that can happen as a result of what's going on now. So, I'm going to have to try and defend my source a little bit. A top executive at a Big Six club was the last person I spoke to just before.
Who was it? Tell me now, immediately.
Yeah, going to make it sound really dramatic and exciting. Yeah. But they were saying, look, because we're the strongest clubs, there are some weird opportunities coming up here. If a lot of other clubs are needing money very, very quickly because of the financial hit that they're taking, the transfer market is going to look very weird. Like, there's going to be a lot of fire sales going on, and the bigger clubs are going to start picking off players at a very cheap price because they can afford to keep the ones that they have, and other clubs are going to be in desperate need for short-term cash injections. And
you mean like they're buying all the toilet paper, right? Is that the analogy we can draw? They have the money to buy all of the toilet paper, and other people don't.
I'm thinking that all the Jack Grealishes in the world, and thinking if we can do an appropriate analogy.
Not toilet paper. That was wrong.
But you can see that scenario kind of play out. I mean, this is, and that isn't kind of a weirdly optimistic scenario. That's a scenario where there's an actual transfer market in this summer. But there are going to be people plotting opportunities out of this for sure. And so there's a lot of kind of gaming out of the scenario going on across football.
Well, I tell you what, it's depressing, but it's also very fascinating. Just a quick interruption in today's podcast for me to remind you that we are supported by The Athletic, the best ad-free, high-quality, sometimes long-form football journalism and indeed sports journalism out there available on the online internet. But Joe, there's no football, so there's nothing to read about. Wrong, voice in my head. In fact, despite the current situation, some of my favourite reads on The Athletic have been released this week. That's totally true. Such as Matt Slater explaining what the new football calendar might look like, which was vital to me understanding what the new football calendar might look like, and or everything Matt Slater writes. Michael Cox did an awesome piece looking back at how Ferguson's United outwitted Inter tactically twice. Take that, Inter. I like Inter. I don't know why I said that. And Simon Hughes, he did an interview with Jamie Carragher in which Carra talks about how amateur football shaped him, which was really interesting. And there's loads more. Honestly, it's actually been a really good week despite everything. I would highly recommend that you go and get your 7-day free trial and see if you like it. Because jokes aside, The Athletic is currently my go-to for both stories following the coronavirus situation and those deliberately not following it. So a healthy dose of realism and an ability to follow the story, and also a lovely bit of escapism when I don't want to think or talk about it anymore. Goodness gracious me. Okay. Well, anyway, that's theathletic.co.uk/Tifo. Go, do it now. 7-day free trial, 50% off an annual subscription, £2.50 a month. Affordable, intelligent, informative, and fun. Hey, back to Murad. Let us move on, though, because I'd really rather not spend the entire time talking about coronavirus, as I'm sure also presumably it's all you're talking about at the moment, right?
It's all I'm thinking about.
Yeah, God, I know. It's awful, isn't it? Every single conversation. Really try and move away from it. Let's talk about Jim Rattcliffe. That sounds fun. Okay. You wrote a really interesting long read on Jim Rattcliffe, and I don't know how to say his company's name. Ineos? Ineos. That makes a lot more sense. Yeah. Yes, Ineos. Jim Rattcliffe and Ineos. So Jim Rattcliffe, British billionaire, owner of Ineos. The company has spent £400 million on sporting enterprises in the last few years. Will you tell me a little bit about him? And I'm going to ask you, I suppose, why a very wealthy person or a very wealthy company would want to spend that much money on sport and what they get from it. But first, would you tell me a little bit about Jim Rattcliffe?
So Jim Rattcliffe is a guy who became rich relatively late in life. So he was a kind of chemical engineer, and around the age of 40, he founded this business, Ineos, which is a massive chemicals business, which runs power plants and and does fracking around the world and builds a lot of the basic building blocks of materials that we need for general life. And the way he built this business was he swallowed up lots of parts of companies like bits of BP and others that were being run pretty badly, and he ran them much better, and made a ton of money out of it. So he built this kind of petrochemicals company. He's now 67, 68. I'm pretty sure it's 67. And he's in his 60s. He's also a complete sports freak. You know, he's a mountaineer. He's a sailor. He was a boyhood Manchester United fan and season ticket holder. He's a keen cyclist. You know, he's like that obsessive guy who does all of the sports, everything, and can afford to do so. So he gets to his 60s. He's rich relatively late in life. He's got a kind of carpe diem attitude, and he starts spending his huge wealth now. He's one of Britain's richest men, and the other weird thing about the structure of Ineos is that only 3 people own it. So most big businesses like this, which are worth tens of billions of pounds, they're owned by lots and lots of shareholders who own a little part of it and are making money out of it. And anyone who runs a business is responsible to all their shareholders. So you can't just go and suddenly chuck a whole load of money at sport just like that, because you have to justify that to loads and loads of hundreds and hundreds of shareholders. That's not the case at Ineos. There's 3 people who own the business. Jim Ratcliffe owns 60%, and a couple of his business partners own 20% each. So he can do what he wants with his money.
Right.
And he can do what he wants with Ineos's money. And what he's starting to do is buy up sport in lots of different ways. So the football club he owns is OGC Nice in France, but also Lausanne Sport in Switzerland. But he's also done things like he's become the principal sponsor to the Mercedes F1 Formula One team. He has funded Eliud Kipchoge's successful attempt to run a marathon in less than 2 hours.
Yeah.
He's funding the now Team Ineos cycling team that was formerly Team Sky. He's funding Britain's attempts to win the America's Cup through Sir Ben Ainslie, the Olympic sailor. He's doing all these sorts of things. None of these entities, everything he's doing here, apart from maybe the football clubs, can't really make money, and he doesn't have any intention of making money.
Yeah.
So the question is, like, what the hell's he doing? Why is he spending all this money? Like,
Right,
why do it in the first place? And so there's a dark theory and a more light theory. I'm not quite sure that makes sense, but the dark theory is that he runs an inherently polluting company. No matter how well they try and say that they're a good environmental actor, it is a polluting company.
Sure.
And so activists say that this is a greenwashing exercise. By planting Ineos over loads of stuff that we are loving and being interested in, you're getting good connotations about Ineos as a result. And you can see that argument has played out in other kinds of sport. So Abu Dhabi's ownership of Manchester City and City Football Group, this kind of group of clubs around the world. I know, because I've spoken to enough people, that at least one of the motivating factors was to improve Abu Dhabi's image in the rest of the world by being associated with sport. And
Sportswashing.
Sportswashing
versus greenwashing.
Yeah, I mean, it's all washing of some sort, but it's effectively reputation management through sport. Like,
sure.
because we sports journalists are pretty blinkered we will focus on all the sporting stuff and kind of ignore the bad stuff in the background. That's the kind of thinking. And I know, like, city executives with a link to Abu Dhabi, they're kind of delighted by the way that Abu Dhabi had been seen for a long time before the whole financial fair play issue started really rearing its head.
Yeah.
I've spoken to people who were at Paris Saint-Germain at the time that the Qataris took over there, and they say, look, you cannot see that club as anything other than a political entity. They make decisions for political reasons, including buying Neymar. Neymar for 100 million euros more than anybody had ever paid for a team. I was told one of the reasons for that is 2 weeks beforehand, or shortly beforehand, other Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia and the UAE, start a economic and political embargo of Qatar. And one way of Qatar saying we've got a ton of liquidity and we are going to carry on business as usual is do this flashy transfer of Neymar from Barcelona to PSG. So given that, there is an argument that there are owners of football clubs or sporting entities out there. The reason they do it is not necessarily the money; it's about kind of reputation management. Now, going back to Jim Ratcliffe, the reason why that argument isn't totally satisfying, and is definitely something that Ineos completely deny, is that nobody had heard of Ineos, really. Like, you and I wouldn't have heard of Ineos. Jim Ratcliffe wasn't a big household name. So
they jokingly describe it as the biggest company you've never heard of. I think you're right that one of their executives says that.
Yeah, and they kind of they were proud of that. So weirdly, you've got this perverse thing happened where, because he's gone and spent 400 million on these flashy sporting outfits, people are noticing him, and people are starting to ask questions about his business. It's kind of this kind of reverse impact. And the only satisfying answer that I could find is from Jim Ratcliffe's brother. So Jim Ratcliffe wouldn't speak to me, but his brother runs Nice now, Bob Ratcliffe, and he's quite a compelling guy,
right.
Bob. And he just said, I think it's not in the story, but I remember it vividly. I said, well, why is he doing this? And he said, well, because he could. He just could. He's got a ton of money.
Sure.
We're all going to die. Why not? Why not sit in the back of a car and watch your Tour de France team go up a mountain? Why not sit in a boat with Ben Ainsley in your America's Cup boat? Why not try and get one of your teams into the Champions League and win it?
That's a very compelling argument.
Yeah, you can see why somebody might want to do those things, and I kind of came away thinking that that's probably the main reason this is all happening.
Right, that's interesting. It reminded me when you were talking about Qatar and the Saudi Arabia and UAE blockade. I think one of the funniest things about that, I don't know if you remember, was allegedly the Saudis saying that as part of the blockade, they were going to dig a 100-mile trench between the two countries and fill it with nuclear waste. Which is the thing I always remember as the funniest thing about that.
It's probably petty stuff, right? And if you really, I mean, this is completely side note. I mean, if you really get into it, there's a lot of ego attached.
Sure.
To the Gulf states operate. They're all kind of related to each other. They know each other, like, personally. They know each other, and so sport had also been another way that they can have a kind of a proxy battle. My team is better than your team. Yeah. And I have to say, the clubs themselves say this is one, incredibly simplistic, and two, not true. That they're building sporting entities designed to win, and business groups that are diversify away from oil and gas and that sort of stuff. And that's one of the reasons. But there's certainly a political element to those clubs as well.
Yeah, for sure.
It's just harder to paint on something like the Ineos project it isn't as natural to join the dots in that in that way.
Which is what makes it such an interesting story, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I often think that vanity is often the best way of explaining why owners own sporting entities.
Right.
There is money to be made at the top end, but they don't often make that much sense as a kind of an investment. So there's a professor of sports management called Stefan Szymanski, who co-wrote Soccernomics and has been hugely influential. And he's pretty down on owners of sports clubs, football clubs and sports clubs. He basically says something along the lines of this. This is his theory. It's like a lot of people who end up owning sports clubs these days, they used to be the local business owner, and your rise to local royalty is to own the local football club, make a huge loss, but be the most important person in that town.
Right, yeah.
And then the Premier League or all these leagues went global, and now you've got these big billionaires who are coming in, and they've been incredibly lucky all their lives. Because of all the thousands of people who didn't have that stroke of luck or insight or whatever it was that helped them, allow them to build their huge business and build their wealth, they've got to the top of this industry in some way, shape or form, and they think it's because they're geniuses. You know,
right.
I'm one of the richest people on earth. I'm a self-made man, almost always a man. So obviously I'm going to be able to take over a football club, which is not that much money for me, and I'll replicate that. I'll naturally become a winner.
Right.
And they buy a football club and then they fail miserably. And the reason they fail miserably is because football and sport is actually, one, an efficient market, and two, very, very competitive, and you can't be shielded from competition like most companies are. This idea that companies are living in this like really competitive landscape, that's nonsense. Like, often they've found some way of shielding themselves from competition, but you can't do that in football and you can't do that in sport. And so they end up buying a football club, and they quickly realise that they're dumb as the rest of us,
right,
and
yeah.
they got lucky along the way.
They're just the man down the pub.
Yeah, and to bring it back to Ineos for a second. I mean, Ineos bought a Swiss club. The first thing they did, they bought a Swiss club called Lausanne Sport, and they did it partly because they were already sponsoring the hockey club attached to Lausanne, and they thought it was a natural next step. And they tried to overspend on players and did all the mistakes that you normally do, and they got relegated. And and you know, Bob Rattcliffe, Jim's brother, says, you know, we learned that just being fans isn't going to be good enough.
Yeah,
you need smart football people, for want of a better term, to run the club. You need good advice. You need to have a different. You know, you need to do this seriously. And so it took them a couple of years before they went and bought Nice, and they're trying to build it up very, very slowly and steadily. And they're trying to get all these sporting entities to start talking to each other and share best practice and help each other win. And all of that is quite interesting, but it's a long-term project. And anyone who says that football isn't very, very complicated, it's a simple game, but it's very complicated to get to the top of it.
Hey, off the back of that as well, I think I read in the article that Ratcliffe said that they will eventually evaluate bids for other European clubs as well, a bit like the City Football Group, and it caused me to think about City Football Group and the Red Bull network as well. What is the benefit of building a network like that for a company? I mean, short of just a wider reputational gain, why would a business be interested in buying multiple clubs and creating a network, for want of a better term?
Yeah, right. So I can talk you through the logic of it, and I can talk you through my skepticism of it as well.
Yes, please.
So okay, City Football Group. is a kind of brainchild of one particular man within the kind of within that company, and that's Ferran Soriano. Ferran Soriano is the chief executive of City Football Group in Manchester City. He ran Barcelona for a while, and the way that Barcelona is basically Barcelona's a socio owned by lots of different members. They vote for somebody, a president, to run the club, and there's an executive team, and they're all made up of the Catalan business elite, basically.
Right, yeah.
And Ferran Soriano's big insight was that Barcelona's just this one club. If we could have entities all around the world that had the Barcelona brand, you could make even more money. And the reason why you want to make more money is there's a direct correlation between how much you spend on players and winning on the pitch. This idea of buying matches, that's a true thing. Football's an efficient market. And Barcelona wouldn't go for it. He had a deal in place to buy the New York franchise of Major League Soccer. He created that deal. He took that to Barcelona. They wouldn't have it. And he was very frustrated. He left. Abu Dhabi buys Manchester City, and they start doing this thing where they're just pumping lots of money in, but it's not really going anywhere. They look around, they see which models they admire. They look at Barcelona. They get Ferran Soriano in, and he pitches them this kind of wider model beyond Manchester City. And because they've got tons of money, they can afford to go for it. Why not try and have a complete original model to this?
And they're ambitious.
They start buying, and they're ambitious, and why not? We like this idea. If you're trying to spread the brand, spread it around the world. So they buy clubs in the US, Australia. They become the majority shareholders in Japan, and they start, building this network. And there's lots of reasons why they think this network is going to help them long term. One is you build a scouting network which is trying to get the best players in the world to the central entity, the hub, which is Manchester City. But along the way, you're finding all these other interesting players, and you've got nowhere to plant them if you find them. So you could put them in clubs around the world, and all of those will help because they have a resale value at some point. Those can help make you money. For example, Aaron Moy was a player that was at Melbourne, one of their clubs, and when they sold him to, I think it was Huddersfield eventually. It was for about 10 million odd pounds. That was the amount of money that was required to buy Melbourne City, their franchise in Australia.
I didn't know that.
Right. So there's, money kind of moves around in this way, in the way that football works.
Yeah.
You have academies all around the world. You have scouts all around the world. And maybe a player, and in an ideal world, they would have a player like Aaron Moy bounce between clubs all around the world, getting slightly harder until they hit the first team of Manchester City, which is the central project of everything.
Yeah.
And that only works if all of those clubs all play in a certain style. So the Pep Guardiola style is one that is implemented tactically across every one of these clubs, because they all have to play the same way, because they're all scouted the same way and they're all kind of coached the same way. So every club now has an Edison-style goalkeeper who can play with his feet.
Yeah.
That's kind of a central mission. It's all possession, attacking-based football. And the reason you do that is because how can you bounce around all these clubs if one club's playing long ball and another club is playing completely different style? So it's kind of this... It's this overarching way of thinking about football, of industrializing football. Now, the bigger, that's all, there's a logic to all of that. The problem is there hasn't really been a player that's come from one of the sister clubs from around the world and broken into the Manchester City first team. It's just not happened.
That has happened with Red Bull, though, hasn't it? Like once or twice, a player has gone from Salzburg to Leipzig and moved on. I'm struggling to think of names, but I know that's true, right?
Yeah, that is true, and I think it's because it's a slightly smaller network and it's all based in Europe.
Right.
You know, Salzburg and Leipzig. The kind of there's a easy enough jump. You could think from Austrian to
you could get a train.
Football. You could, yeah, but if you're good enough, you can make that jump. It's very clear where which is the better league.
Yeah,
the variations aren't that big between the two. A kind of a really good example of how a network of clubs can really help you is Watford. The Pozzo family who own Watford also own Udinese, and Udinese was originally the kind of the hub of the network. They used to own Granada in Spain as well.
Yeah.
And you can see that they own players between these clubs very, very often. One club buys a player and then they loan it to the other. And the reason they're trying to do that is things like they're trying to get past the UK work permit regime, and the best way they can do that is be at an Italian club for a certain amount of time. That allows them to move to Watford.
Sure.
At some point in the future, those smaller networks seem to have worked. The all-encompassing global one doesn't seem naturally like the variations of ability that you need to play in Uruguayan football, because they own Atletico Torque in Uruguay, to the Major League Soccer in the US, to the A-League in Australia, to the Premier League. It's just so vast. It's unimaginable.
Yeah.
And it's unclear that is going to work. Now, it's very interesting that they're talking to a French club at the moment, Nancy, in the French second division. They have this link into Spanish football. You can see that they're starting to focus in on Europe a bit more now.
Well, they need to bridge that gap, right? If it is the situation of there being the jump in quality being too high, then presumably the answer to that is to buy a European club.
Yeah, but the problem with that is that the rules say that UEFA and FIFA rules say that you can't own clubs that are going to be in the same competition as each other. So Red Bull get around this by not being, I can't remember if it's Leipzig or Salzburg, which is they heavily influence the running of a club, but they're not quite owners, so they kind of get away with it.
Oh, I see. I see.
But you wouldn't be able to do that in Europe. You wouldn't be able to buy like a top team in France or Spain, because there's an obvious sense that if you own two clubs that are going to play each other in the Champions League, how do they have a fair match against each other?
Could you buy a French second division team then?
Yeah, I think the idea is you buy teams that won't have that problem,
right?
And at least that problem won't be tested anytime soon.
Yeah,
it's a kind of thinking. And in the case of Ineos, so Ineos buy OGC Nice. One of the reasons they buy Nice is because they have a tour of the training ground of Chelsea, and Chelsea's for sale, for sure. And they're quoted somewhere between £2 and £4 billion, and they think, no, we're not going to spend that kind of money. And they get a chance to look at Newcastle United. Newcastle United are currently asking price for that is £350 million. And the Ineos guys say, well, what's the best we can do? I mean, Bob Rattcliffe, again, this is stuff he said and didn't use in the piece. He said, well, the best you can do is the Everton Cup. We're not really in it for that. 7th place isn't what we're aiming for here.
Yeah.
And the big 6 clubs all have multi-billion pound for sale signs on them, and he says they're all for sale. That's him,
wow.
not me. And that's all great. The owners have done brilliantly to build up these clubs, but no one's actually paid that price before. That hasn't been tested. You can have the theoretical value of billions, but no one's actually paid that, and they're never going to be dumb money. So they looked outside and they looked at France and they thought they could get better value, and they think over time they can build it into a Champions League club. And if they do look for other clubs, it would be lower down the leagues across Europe as a way, as a kind of a feeder system. So I think they definitely they admire the Red Bull model, and they look at that as a more sensible model for all their sporting entities, more than a City Football Group, which has got much broader and bigger global ambitions that haven't really been proven quite yet.
I wonder, I don't know if these are just rumours. I'm not in the position that you are, where I speak to club executives and stuff. So this is stuff I read on the rumour pages of the internet. But I did read that the Glazers were allegedly going to visit the I can't remember what the actual conference was called, but they were calling it the Davos in the desert in Saudi Arabia, to talk to the Saudis or Mohammed bin Salman about buying the club. And then the Jamal Khashoggi assassination occurred in Turkey, and it scared everyone, and no one went to the conference. And then there was a discussion that they were going to meet again. I wonder if maybe coronavirus presumably has put a halt on that again. It's going to happen at some point, right? I mean, someone's going to spend a lot of money on a football club, and they're going to trigger one of those for sale signs you're talking about. And presumably it's going to be Saudi Arabia?
I don't know. This is something I've been trying to get inside for a very, very long time.
Say no more.
Your course of events sounds, from what I've been told, is all correct, apart from the following year, after the Khashoggi murder, and everything in the business world had calmed down somewhat. That Manchester United executives were at the Future Investment Forum, they call it, and they were giving presentations there. And the closest we heard to anything really happening was that the Saudi sovereign wealth fund, called the Public Investment Fund, the PIF as it's known, were looking for a minority investment in Manchester United. That's as close as we've got to it. We never, I haven't seen anything properly legit that tells me that there was a bid on the table for Manchester United. But Newcastle is those talks are happening. We know that they're happening, and it's a completely weird situation. 80% of this £350 million bid for Mike Ashley's Newcastle United, and I'm sure a lot of the fans will love it that I called it Mike Ashley's, but he owns the club, is coming from Saudi Investment Fund. Then most of the rest of it comes from Amanda Staveley, who owned a private equity firm, but also was the original broker to the Man City deal way back when. It's not entirely clear to me why Amanda Staveley's in this deal at all. There's this weird story that was in the Wall Street Journal that she's connected to an influencer who used to be friends with Kim Kardashian, who is close to the head of the Public Investment Forum, and they're all kind of connected to each other, and they're sitting on the same boat making these deals. I mean, it is mad that things like the world operates in this way, but it does seem to operate in this way.
It really does,
And so it isn't clear to us why the Saudis are operating in this way through Amanda Staveley for this deal. They don't need to, but they seem to be doing so. I get very angry Newcastle fans on my feed because I write a story saying that they're in talks and they're relatively close to a deal, but and no deal has taken place. So that naturally means all my reporting was incorrect. But from what I'm told, these talks are live and they're still ongoing, and the Saudis are pumping a lot of money into sport, and it does seem natural that they would buy a Premier League team at some point.
Right.
But it'd be quite a flashy move to go for Manchester United. Like
yeah, it would be, huh?
Well, just imagine the British media,
of which you are a part, Murad.
of which I am kind of a part. The Financial Times is a weird place. We kind of everybody talk. It's like we don't really count ourselves as part of the British media.
I feel like that's what everyone does.
We're the global media.
Yeah, right. Okay. Yeah,
we just have an office in London
that you don't use anymore.
Yeah, currently,
Are you okay for another couple of minutes?
Yeah, sure.
I just wanted to ask you questions about you, if that's okay.
Sure.
You have an unusual role in that you are, I guess a football journalist, but not in the mold that the other football journalists are. How did you end up in your role? Like, how did you get to? Did you study like business and finance, or did you want to be a journalist or a football journalist? I guess is the question I'm asking.
I feel like I'm a really odd fish in this particular world.
Best kind of fish, Murad.
Yeah, I'm treated oddly as well. I find, but in ways that are generally beneficial. So I started as a trainee reporter at the Times newspaper. Fell into a job covering technology when my very greying editors thought the internet was a bit of a fad and you should get the young guy to do that.
Young guy.
Kind of things like, the Asian guy, makes sense he would do IT.
Sure,
that sort of
right.
thing.
You understand computers, yeah.
Yeah, just give it to him. And then the iPhone, the iPad, Twitter, Facebook happens, and it becomes one of the biggest stories in the world. I covered Silicon Valley and so on. And I moved to the FT to cover technology, partly because the FT's pitch to me was that technology is a front page story for us, and it's never going to be at the Times, and that is absolutely true.
So what the hell happened?
And then so the FT has a weird relationship with sport in that my first tangle with it was there's a job that came up a couple of months before the Olympic Games, which is called the leisure correspondent, and the leisure correspondent covers hotels, gambling, restaurants, the cruise industry, like really
all the best things,
all the stuff.
Yeah.
And also sport. And whoever had done the leisure correspondence job for the last 10 years also went to the Olympic Games as the sports correspondent. And I knew this, and I immediately applied and got the job.
You're sounding a little bit like Jim Rattcliffe right now.
Yeah, I mean, because
why not?
I thought, why not? I'd done technology for a long time. And whoever had done the leisure correspondence job had always done, more than half their time was covering sport and sporting stories, just because money-wise, it's not as big as the hotel industry. Genuinely isn't. But the impact-wise and the amount that people want to read is kind of endless. And this kind of, I ended up falling into it, and I've ended up doing two basically ways of kind of defining myself against everyone else. One is that I do it heavily as a corporate story. I actually do it as a business story, and all my news is really about the money in sport.
Yeah.
So that's why Ineos and City Football Group and Qatar and PSG are all super interesting, because their politics and their business stories as much as their sports stories. And then the other thing is, like, I really like writing long, thorough pieces. So I go away and spend 2 weeks doing the most in-depth story you can possibly do about something in sport, and that can be really geeky sports stories. Like I did the first magazine story on sport I did was how to save a penalty kick, by talking to scientists and game theories. And Valencia's Diego Alves, or he used to be at Valencia, who had a ridiculously high save rate, and spoke to goalkeepers around the world, and we did 4,000 words on that, and it took 2 months to report. there aren't that many people doing doing sport to that level of seriousness.
Yeah, right.
In that way. So those are they're the two things that I add. It means that the rest of the industry either doesn't know or care about me, and that's fine, or treats me in a really weird way, like the way that the football journalists all interact with each other, I still find very strange.
Sure.
They're called the pack.
Yeah.
And I'm very much not of the pack.
No, me neither.
Yeah, I'm kind of fine with that. That works for me.
What's that Groucho Marx quote, huh?
Yeah, exactly. We wouldn't ever repeat the quote because we know it intimately. Yeah,
exactly. Hey man, well listen, thanks so much for coming. I really appreciate it. I found it very interesting to talk to you, as you have described your role as oddly unique. That's what interests me so much about it. So thank you for your time and extensive knowledge.
Well, not at all, and hopefully I'll actually get to meet you physically at some point in the future.
I know, wouldn't that be cool? If we're allowed outside of our houses, let's do it, man.
Yeah, you have a studio. That would be great.
I know. Yeah, I've brought all my stuff home right now, and tell you what, I couldn't be happier because I'm surrounded by dark wood and books, and I never thought this was who I am. But it is. I've been so happy.
I'm not going to lie. I'm in my bed with the duvet over me. That's why I've been so relaxed.
Under there for an hour. Okay, it's time to get out now.
Yeah,
Murad, thanks so much, man, and hopefully we'll speak to you again soon.